Welcome to Interfaith Communities for Dialogue of Fairfax County, Virginia. This is a recording of a workshop held on November 8, 2020, on the topic of the evidence and impact of racism on the education, police, and judicial systems. It is the second in a four-part series on racism and systemic bias, presented by the Interfaith Communities for Dialogue. The panelists for this program are Captain Darrell Nichols, the Equity Lead for the Fairfax County Police Department on One Fairfax, Sean Perryman, President of the Fairfax NAACP, and Mike Woltz, Chair of the Title I Parent Advisory Committee to the Fairfax County School Board. We open as the program is being introduced by ICD Chair 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝. I'm the chair of ICD, and we'd like to welcome you to this second workshop on racism that we are conducting on behalf of ICD. A very special welcome to our three panelists for the workshop today. You can see them on the screen. They are Mike Woltz, Chair of the Diversity and Inclusion and Outreach Committee in Northern Virginia, Captain Darrell Nichols, who's the Equity Lead from the Fairfax, from One Fairfax and the Fairfax County Police Department, and Sean Perryman, who's the President of the Fairfax NAACP. We'll give you a more detailed introduction to the speakers just after I stop speaking. But before that, it would be good for you to just get a very brief introduction to ICD as well. We showed you some slides. As you may know, ICD stands for Interfaith Communities for Dialogue. It's a voluntary organization that was founded 16 years ago in 2004. It currently has 10 organizational members. You can see the names of these 10 members on the slide on the left-hand side. You'll notice that 6 faiths are represented: the Christian, Jewish, Muslim, Baha'i, Hindu, and Sikh faiths at the moment. We are expecting more might join in the coming years. The way ICD is organized is that each ICD member sends representatives to our steering committee. So the steering committee is very diverse, and we meet every month to discuss what we plan to do and review what we've already done. We have been conducting interfaith dialogues and other projects since the beginning of ICD. So we have some experience of doing this. And we're also fortunate that ICD's founders, including Murray Monson from the John Calvin Presbyterian Church, who's currently our vice chair and chair emeritus for ICD, and some of the other founders who started this organization, remain active on the ICD steering committee. So we have the benefit of their experience and guidance as we continue to do this work. And we're thankful for their valuable service to the community. Very quickly, our mission, we have it on the slide. ICD is a network of faith-based and associated organizations, as you can see. It is dedicated to promoting mutual understanding and positive relationships among the diverse people in and around Fairfax County. We are active in 3 areas: education, engagement, and capacity building for interfaith work. The main purpose of ICD is to facilitate mutual respect through interfaith collaboration. We are currently updating our strategic plan that was produced 5 years ago. So we think it's necessary to factor in all the changes that have taken place since then. And once that is approved, we'll also change our bylaws to reflect the new strategic plan. So that work is ongoing. Now, a couple of words on why we think racism is important to address at this time by an interfaith group. As you can see from this slide, the emphasis on racism is very consistent with our mission. ICD promotes inclusiveness, integrity, mutual respect, and trust of all people in our community. We stand in unity and support when any member of our community is targeted by disparaging or hateful words or actions. and we believe strongly that all people of all faiths must bear witness and oppose the racial inequality and brutality facing people of color, especially in this country. ICD has recently issued a formal statement to this effect. It's a joint statement from all 10 organizational members of the organization of ICD. And it was also approved by the leadership of each of the 10 ICD members. Now, today's workshop is the second in a series of 4 workshops that we plan to have over the next several months. The first one was held on the 25th of October, and the focus was racism and systemic bias. It gave us a framework, the conceptual understanding of what racism involves, how it operates, and we had a wonderful speaker for that workshop, 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭 Jones, and the record of that workshop is available to all members of the ICD community and the Fairfax community that joined us in that workshop. In that workshop, we discussed how racism is built into systems, institutions, and personal attitudes. The next 2 workshops will be in January and March of next year, and that will close the 4 that we will expect to have on this topic. I'm extremely glad that Fazia Dean, a member of our ICD steering committee, is facilitating these 4 workshops. Fazia is from Guyana. She studied in Canada and the US, is a lawyer by training, and is the Deputy Outreach Director at Darrell Islamic Center in Falls Church in Virginia. She has focused on racism, interfaith community outreach, and civic engagement, particularly advocating for equity, justice, and fairness among the women and youth in the community around us in Washington, D.C., including Maryland, Virginia, and the D.C. metropolitan area. For ICD, Fazia is co-leading the working group on racism with Judith Shamir, who will be speaking to you later on. So Fazia will introduce the panelists and give you the structure of today's workshop and the ground rules that we'd like to follow. And with this, I'd like to thank you for coming for this workshop, welcome you again, and I'd like to turn it over to Fazia for the next steps in the process. Thanks very much.
Unmute myself. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. It's a beautiful blue day, no pun intended. I'm glad to be here. There's a short video from Muhammad Ali on why everything is white. Enjoy. Interview, Muhammad Ali was being interviewed by Sir Michael Parkinson in the BBC interview. Muhammad Ali suggests that if we pay attention, we'll see that the implicit bias is present all around us in our everyday lives, in key aspects of everything that we do. Today's panelists will help us to understand the evidence and the impact of systemic racism within the education, police, and judicial systems in Fairfax County and elsewhere as well. We will discuss how are people employed in and served by these systems impacted, what is being done to address these issues, and what challenges and successes have we seen. Finally, we'll consider what all of us can do to support these efforts. And I'd like to go ahead at this time and introduce our panelists. We're in no specific order. They're all important. First one on my agenda that I'm looking at on my screen is Mike Woltz. And I've had great opportunity to talk to him several times. He is the chair of Title I Parent Advisory Committee, Fairfax County School Board, which seeks to ensure equity for the students and families in Title I schools. He also chairs the Diversity, Inclusion, and Outreach Committee of the Northern Virginia PTA and the Legal Redress Committee of the Fairfax NAACP. He is the father of two students in Fairfax County Public Schools and has spearheaded fatherhood engagement initiatives. In his professional life, he is an attorney for the federal government. And with that, I will now introduce, for some reason, I lost it. Is it this one? Sorry, my hand just moved my introductions. Okay, sorry about that, guys. So next up, we have our second panelist, Captain Darrell Nichols, whom I've also had the benefit of talking to a lot this week. And he is the equity lead for the Fairfax County Police Department in One Fairfax. He has been with the department since 1992 and currently serves as one of the 4 staff duty officers assigned to the patrol division in which he commands field operations. Captain Nichols is the co-chair for the Human Relations Policy Committee, which focuses on procedural justice. He has led numerous town hall meetings focused on equity in policing and race. He's led community inclusion groups focused on reviewing FCPD policies and procedures to ensure equity and racial equity. Wow, okay, I need a drink of water. And collaborated with external partners. He is also a passionate mentor, coach, and expert communicator with a high EQ and graduate degree in Homeland Security from American Military University in West Virginia. Captain Nichols is an innovative police leader who is focused on building and sustaining community relations. Welcome. And our last panelist, the Sean Perryman, president of the Fairfax NAACP. He has been a leader on addressing the school to prison pipeline, police reform, affordable housing, worker protections during coronavirus pandemic, a frequent speaker and author on race, equity, and police and criminal justice reform. Sean is also an acknowledged leader and speaker for equity in technology and artificial intelligence policy. So don't be shy with your questions. After graduating from 𝐏𝐵𝐲𝐶 College, Sean went on to earn a law degree from Vanderbilt University. He currently works as the director of social impact policy at Internet Association, IA, and recently announced he's running for Lieutenant Governor of Virginia. He and his family reside in Northern Virginia, where he strives to give back to the community every day. Welcome, everyone. And welcome all those who are participating today. Now, a little bit about the structure today is each speaker will be given, about 7 minutes to give us a presentation. Then there will be a facilitated Q&A. Judith will be facilitating your questions on chat, and then she will forward them to me. Let's see, what else do we have to talk about? And then we'll have that Q&A, and the panelists will have an opportunity to respond to your questions. And then we'll have another short video on the prison pipeline, school to prison pipeline. There will be another Q&A. In that second Q&A, we will be also including raised hands in the Zoom option. So not only can you use the chat option, you will be in that second Q&A able to raise your hands. And once we facilitate you in, then you will be allowed to ask the panelists a direct question. Let's see what happens here. By 5:45, we will conduct a poll. And I hope that you're all going to participate in that poll. And then about 5:50-ish, we will hear some concluding remarks from our panelists. And then Judith will talk about a survey. and do some closing out remarks. And our president of ICD, Pammy, will then speak before closing out. And that's our structure for today. And if I forget anything, I know Judith will help me out and fill you in on that. So without further ado, each speaker is given 7 minutes and there's no preference here. Sean's photo is up on my screen. Did you want to go first, Sean? And Sean will be presenting the judicial system. Welcome, Sean. We're looking forward to hearing from you.
Hey, everyone, and thanks for introducing me. I appreciate being here. They told me to present on the justice system and some of the issues that we're seeing in criminal justice generally. I know Mike will be talking about education, so I don't want to step on his toes too much, but I don't think that we should look at these issues as siloed off. A lot of times the issues that we are facing aren't neatly packaged into, this segment or that segment. But really quickly, my name is Sean Perryman. I'm the president of the Fairfax NAACP. So happy to be here. I smiled when they were introducing Mike because even though I'm the president, he does all the work because he's our legal redress chair. And I'm sure he hates me for making him get involved with that. So I always smile when they introduce him. But the issues we're facing here of racism, and we're talking about racism here, and it's, this is a hard conversation for anyone to have, right? Because you look at this as sort of the third rail of the American political system, the third rail of American discourse. You're taught not to talk about religion, race, or politics. Here we are in an interfaith group talking about a lot of those things all at once. So because we don't talk about these issues, we're really not well versed on how to communicate with people who have different ideas about this. But if I look at Virginia and Fairfax County, a lot of the issues that we're facing, there are clear racial disparities, and we have to put a name on this, not just racism, but anti-Black racism. They are affecting the Black community in particular. And this is very important to understand, especially when we're talking to a diverse audience like we have today. If we look at Fairfax County, I always talk about the use of force statistics. Even though Black residents make up 9% of the county, they account for 50% or nearly 50% of use of force cases. I think it's somewhere around 44 to 45%. So when the police decide to use force, it's often against Black people within the county. And that's a problem. If we look at the school system here in Fairfax, compared to other jurisdictions and across the nation, we don't have a high number of arrests, but we are the 10th largest county, and when you have big numbers, even 1% arrests, those are hundreds of kids that get arrested. And those are often disproportionately Black, Latino, and disabled students. So when I talk about the criminal justice system, it's helping people understand that what may make you feel safe having an officer present. As a white individual, you say, oh, well, that makes me feel safe them being there. The data doesn't bear out that necessarily in schools that makes you safe. And in fact, in some cases for Black, Latino, and disabled students, that may be put you at risk because that officer is not trained to interact with certain types of students. They're not. So these are all parts of the conversation that we need to have when we talk about the justice system. I also talk about marijuana, and then I talk about that at the Virginia statewide level. In Virginia, marijuana arrests make up the majority of drug arrests here in the Commonwealth. And if you're Black, even though white individuals and Black individuals use cannabis at the same rate, you're 3 times more likely to be arrested if you're Black. So these are some of the statistics that we're dealing with, but the stories behind this are heartbreaking because if you're arrested for this follows you for the rest of your life. It dictates how the jobs you get and everything else. So this is why these issues are so clear. And it's ironic because across the nation, we're seeing more and more states legalize cannabis. But here in Virginia, over the last 2 to 3 years, we've increased the number of arrests that we've made related to that drug. So these are some of the criminal justice issues that we're facing. And so I will talk a little bit about that more as we go along. I know I have a limited time for my introduction, but I want people to feel that they can speak to me and ask me any question that they want. I know these conversations are difficult, and if you ever feel like, hey, Sean, that sounds like BS to me, say it, and I will gladly address the issue, because that's the only way we're going to understand each other and get get to some sort of understanding. But I'll close my remarks with this. I look at it as in every element of the justice system, we see disproportionate arrest of Black people. We see disparities in the way that Black individuals are treated. And it's true for many minority groups, but especially Black people. And we're even seeing it in the criminal justice system as we look at technologies of the future. Facial recognition is starting to be widely used by jurisdictions without any regulations. And it is more likely than not to misidentify Black people, older people, and women. So we can get into why that is. But even as we look at future technology that is giving us the promise of, no human bias, we're still seeing some of the same disparities in the use of those technologies. So these are all the things we're facing from the criminal justice system. But I'll be happy to get into why I see some of these things happen, what my opinion are why these things happen, and talk about anti-Blackness as it relates to the justice system. But I wanted to lay out some of that in the disparities in arrests, the disparities in our education system, and also cannabis, and that being such a huge drug-related arrests here in Virginia, and why that's such a huge issue when we talk about criminal justice. And with that, I'll stop and pass it on to the next panel.
So Sean, I think you still have a minute or so left.
Sure.
And what I want you to do in that minute or so is to kind of elaborate, because you touched on something that's very, very core to our hearts here at ICD, Interfaith Communities. And that is the high school to prison pipeline. And I know you know a lot about this, and I don't know if you were saving it for later, but can you give us a little bit background on it? Because I know you did this in another webinar, and I just love the way you laid it out.
Yeah, and I think you said high school to prison pipeline. What people have to understand, this I was actually at a panel. It was called the preschool to prison pipeline, because it starts at such an early age. The way that Fairfax NAACP really engaged on this issue was about 2 or 3 years ago. We were seeing kids as early as middle school being arrested, and we saw the same disparities that we see nationwide, Black and Latino students. When we dug into the numbers, we were kind of shocked that they weren't being arrested for violent crime or drug use or whatever. It was inherently subjective things like disorderly conduct. And so imagine, I don't know about you in middle school, but I was probably disorderly in middle school. Should I have been arrested for that? So it's these issues where you're saying, well, what does this charge really mean? We were able to work with the police department and the Board of Supervisors to change what they call the MOU, the Memorandum of Understanding between the police and schools. And what that document does is say how the police can operate within the school system. At the time, some of the things that they had in there were really concerning. Police could monitor for cultural tendencies, and it had a lot of concerning language. When we were able to make those changes, and we were able to give them less discretion to act within schools, we saw a 60% reduction in arrests countywide within the first year. Within the second year, we saw a 45% reduction in arrests. So we saw meaningful, this is for in a county this big. Now, again, remember, the percentage of kids that arrest are rather small in Fairfax, but still hundreds of kids. So you can make that sort of reduction. You are feeding less kids into that, what we call the school to prison pipeline. And so it's helping people to understand when they talk about school to prison pipeline, it starts with small disciplinary actions. Who are the kids we're suspending? What are we suspending them for? What are we doing to make sure that a kid who may have some issue at home or anything else isn't being thrown away completely? Because once you send a kid to jail, or once you suspend them or arrest them, you're putting them on a path that's very hard to reverse. And we need to make sure that we are identifying that early on, so that we're not throwing these kids away for what is essentially child behavior, misbehavior that could be corrected in other ways. And I'll just say one last thing. One of the controversial things that we're saying at the Fairfax NAACP, and I say it's controversial because some people, they're shocked by it. I say we need to remove the SROs from schools. SROs are school resource officers. And when I say remove them from schools, I mean literally outside of the buildings. Right now, people have the SROs in schools, and they're considered mentors, and they're interacting with students. Again and again, nationally and locally, what we see is If you introduce an officer into school, you are guaranteeing one thing: more arrests of Black, disabled, and Latino students, especially the disability community. Here in Fairfax, we had an issue with restraint and seclusion being used on disabled students. If we want to address that, you can have an officer on the campus, but if you have them interacting day to day with students, this is what we see contributes to the school to prison pipeline. And I know people feel a way about that, but I'm always happy to discuss that. And that's the Fairfax NAACP's position. I've been able to work with Delegate 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐬 at a statewide level of trying to divest from having more officers in the school system. So I'll stop there.
No, and that's great. You stopped at a great point because, and I was going to ask Darrell to speak, but because you ended on this school to prison pipeline, if Darrell doesn't mind, I'm going to go ahead and let Mike chime in here because he's going to speak on education. I think this is a great segue to hear Mike, and then we'll go to Darrell's piece. So Mike, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, 𝐏𝐫𝐲𝐻𝐶. I'll try to keep my own time to make sure I stay on schedule.
Yeah, I was struggling with that too.
My screen times out, but it'll probably make a loud noise when I hit it. So anyways, I think it's important that there's an understanding of what racism is, because if you don't have a clear enough understanding of what it is and how it functions, you're going to be limited in how effective your response can be. It's common and frequent to think of racism as a verb, something somebody does, something somebody says, but the way in which it has a greater impact and controls groups of people is as a noun, like a house, a structure that we can either chip bricks away from, or we can repaint, we can insulate, we can keep it functioning really well. So make sure, when you hear about racism, think about a machine or a house moving along and what is it doing? Now, you may have heard people talk about disproportionate discipline for Black and Latino kids in the school system. And what it looks like on the ground, it's not just, are you being suspended? Are you being expelled? It's how are you being treated in class? It doesn't usually start with a one-time occurrence or flare up and then you're gone. It's often a pattern of treatment, mistreatment, being ignored, being overlooked. And when something does flare up, then something drastic is done, and it's usually meted out against a Black and Latino child. Now, having two sons myself in the system, I was able to see it very closely and all the parties who it affects. Both of my kids, they'd be considered, those are good students because they've been in advanced academic programs. They come from a good socioeconomic background. But my older son, when he was in elementary school, just about every conflict he had from 3rd to 5th grade was with white girls. And often, the majority of the time, I would say they instigated the conflict. Nothing was ever done. And I'm not saying that I wanted them to be suspended or something done to them, but he's on his way out of 5th grade and hearing the principal say, they're kids, we're not suspending them, they're children. We, want to teach them to work out their conflict constructively. Then when my younger son is in 3rd grade, 3 Black boys in his class are suspended. I only found out because he told me, because he was afraid that he might have been too. And the child they had a conflict with, was a white boy. And the real problem with it was that it was an interpersonal conflict that parents got no notice of when the decision was made. It wasn't as if there were constant communications. It was a decision levied out, in the words of the administrator, to send a message. And one of the parents who disputed that got it overturned. The other 2 parents, who were not native born to this country, as is often the cultural norm, did not see it, or for whatever reason, did not go against the school, did not go up against the school. And that's something we find a lot. If you're not from this country, depending on what your understanding is the school where you're from, you're not going to go against the school. And if one of them got it reversed, all of them should have been reversed. And what's more damaging about that is not only how it affects the children and their families, it's the lesson it sends to the folks who are controlling the system. That assistant principal later became a principal of a school. So no matter what somebody says to them, if you are rewarded for the job that you're doing, somebody saying, oh, you shouldn't have done that, it will not register because they got a promotion and now they're running a whole school. And if we look at how schools are populated through teachers to administrators, the majority of them are white women. And that's not an accident. Because again, as my son was in elementary school, who he had conflicts with were white girls, nothing was done to them. Thus, they end school having a positive and productive relationship where coming out, they now look at it as something they want to get back to, they want to be part of. At the same time, those who do not have a positive experience with school will look at it as something they want to get far away from. And that's a cycle that continues over and over and over. So why wouldn't you want to be part of a profession that when you were in the receiving end, you had the most favor bestowed upon you? Like when you think that is how racism functions. It's not one person deciding I'm going to hurt Black kids today, I'm going to hurt Latino kids today. It's a system that goes on and on and on until you stop and look at the processes that are functioning, who they're impacting, and decide to, time out. Let's shut everything down. Let's look at how all these things are playing out. And Sean made a point about SROs, and it's something I didn't even think about until more recently. My older son is in middle school. He's in one of the few middle schools that are 6th to 8th grade. He reported, to his counselor that he felt one of his teachers was discriminating against Black and Latino kids. And I think he did that about 6 times. We were not notified any of those times. It was only the last time because his counselor happened to come by in the hall and saw that very teacher berating him out in the hall with another teacher standing around. Now, if somebody feels threatened or provoked, sometimes they have a defensive response. So imagine if an SRO happened to see that too. The very person who my son says is discriminating against is now attacking him for making that accusation. SRO sees it. And then what happens if he has a negative response? The counselor said, he was very impressed how my son handled it. He didn't know if other people would have handled it in that regard. But if he had reacted loud or with any type of physical demonstration, what happens to him then? SRO interacts with him. Is he going to be arrested? He's going to intersect and get close to the judicial system, criminal justice system, all because a process that didn't include us and a cry he made out for help. I think this teacher is treating us differently, is being ignored, and he's actually being re-traumatized because the very person he's accusing of is now attacking him for doing it. What Fairfax has done right now is talk about it a lot, but they have not really grounded any programs to change. All of the positive change is coming from the outside, pressure made from organizations such as the NAACP, there's other nonprofit groups who are holding them accountable, but I think a lot of it stems from just a fundamental lack of understanding of what racism is and how it works. Everybody was, they took pause when they saw George Floyd murdered on camera, but that's not how racism normally functions. It's happening every day in schools. Kids are being brutalized. There's another young man, Sean talked about special needs. Black boys, special education needs are the most disciplined in the county. We worked on a case with a student who was treated that very way. If he talked about or complained about somebody assaulting him, touching him improperly, the response to him is, these are kids being kids. If he does anything to defend himself, he's identified as a bully or threatening. And an acting principal who comes in a month in their tenure is made a move to recommended that he be reassigned to a school. That principal became permanent principal. So you have these actions that only validate whatever is being done and don't force people to stop, look at it, and interrogate what their process is. I don't want to take too much more time because my timer hit out, but I'm happy to have a further conversation. I just want to make sure I give time for Darrell.
I think you made my heart race a little bit because I have a lot of stories too. I do a lot of mentoring, so I was relating to you, and also I was very blessed to have Miriam, who is a young lady helping us with tech support, and she was just listening to you and saying, "Oh my gosh, I have so many stories I can share as well," because she's in the actual school system. So I want to thank you for bringing the hard examples to light. You know, I think what Sean did was tell us how it happens in the school system and break down the structure. And then you kind of gave us that hard example. So I want to thank you for sharing and talking about your sons and taking it to that personal level. Thank you so much for doing that. And now we will hear from Darrell, and Darrell is going to speak to us on the police side. And then we'll be open for Q&A. So Darrell.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Yeah, just one little note about myself. I am doing all the equity work for the police department now. I'm no longer in operations, just to clarify that. So I can focus on the equity work that's needed within the police department. To try to give a little bit of the why of what's going on in terms of racism and from an institutional standpoint. I remember recently when Colonel Lee brought this task to me and said, "Darrell, I need you to help out with One Fairfax." And he explained to me what One Fairfax was about. It was about race and equity. And I said, "Sir, you want me to talk about race and equity?" And Muhammad Ali, since we talked about him or saw his presentation, talked about climbing a mountain. He said, "I don't really have an issue of climbing a mountain. It's just the pebbles that get into my shoes that caused me a problem while climbing the mountain." And this work, this equity work, is a very heavy lift. I don't have a problem doing it, but when you look at the police department, you start looking at the institution, a law enforcement, the agency, and the things that I'm working on right now within the police department. I'm looking at our policies, our practices, and our attitudes all lead to cultural norms and understanding of what we see in terms of our data. How it looks and what it looks like for the police department in ways that affect everything that Sean talked about and everything that Mike talked about. It looks like our recruiting, our retaining good quality people, our promotions, our professional staff, not civilians, but our professional staff. And it even goes out to our academy, our police academy. And we have to look at our training curriculums. And the biggest thing that affects all of this right now is implicit bias. One of the largest challenges I have right now is to get my colleagues to understand, particularly the command staff, not the line officers, just the command staff, to say that racism exists. It's within the Fairfax County Police Department. Our data shows it. And just to get them to have that difficult conversation is a huge and a monumental task. We've had many conversations, and I watch many of my colleagues squirm when we begin to talk about race. Another challenge is to get my colleagues to realize that just because we have a bias about us doesn't make you a racist person. And because of the makeup of the police department being about 75% white male, it is a huge task. We do have about a third of our agency. They love what we're doing. I have folks tell me all the time, "Darrell, thank you so much. Stick with it. Don't give up." But we have a silent middle that we're focused on. I already know that some of my staff may not receive this and understand it and want to deal with the institution of racism and how it affects our department. And when we look at the bigger picture and how everything gets started with law enforcement and how we engage the community, having these difficult conversations, just getting them there for that conversation is very difficult. One of the things we're doing right now, we just put together a team of ambassadors, and we're going to start training our ambassadors on implicit bias training, procedural justice, and trust building. And part of that will start with our recruiting, our polygraph section, and our background detectives, as well as our internal affairs detectives, because they touch the community more than anybody else in the initial onset other than patrol. Once we train the ambassadors on those areas of implicit bias, trust building, and procedural justice, we're now going to educate those ambassadors and make them and train them and have them go out and train the entire police department. This is a monumental task. This is not something that's going to happen right now. We're looking at this in a 1 to 3 year training period, so we can train everyone on implicit bias and what it means. Part of what we're trying to do to get the officers to understand, we want to deal with the officers at the very onset of hiring. We want to use the African American Museum as a backdrop, because most of the people that we hire come to the Washington metropolitan area and never been around as many people of color like they've been around, and it sends their system into a shock. We want to get them on an early onset and then do a survey in the beginning, survey them about what they understand about racism and race, and then train them right there in the first week of their academy, and then test them in the very end of their academy before they make it to the field training instructors, before they make it to that culture. Because within our agency, it takes about, I guess, anywhere from 8 months to 18 months to really turn a person's mind, to get them to start going down the road of groupthink. And once that happens, and if they don't have the right mentors and the right people in front of them, groupthink occurs. And then it becomes an us versus them kind of mentality. And I don't think a lot of officers realize that. And they get into the mindset that it is them and it is not us, and we're under attack. So the first thing we're trying to do, we're just trying to get them to understand implicit bias, that we all have it. Don't be upset about it, because a lot of things they're doing sometimes is based on an implicit bias. So that's the first step. And then we look at our data. One of the things we want to do, we're going to look at our data and say, hey, who are we stopping and why are we stopping them? And that goes back to the implicit bias. And we know we have a study coming up here shortly from the University of Texas, San Antonio, that's going to talk about disproportionality and disparity and what those numbers mean. I want to dig down deeper into our data, into our record management system, to look at ethnicity. Not only race, look at ethnicity. Because right now, I think when I look at our daily reports that come in from our duty officers, a lot of officers are not classifying the people they contact with the right way. Largely, most people we come in contact with are locked into the white category. It's a monumental training to get them to understand what race and ethnicity look like. So we have some challenges in front of us, and I'll stop right there. And if you have questions, I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Yes, we do have questions coming in, but I have, since I think there's a minute or so, I have something I want to throw into you, Darrell, since we're talking about policing at this point, and you talk about implicit bias. You and I, when we first met, we talked about, we have met before.
Yes.
And I work for 𝗣𝐻𝗲𝗃, and you know 𝗣𝐻𝗃 community. We're
Absolutely.
about 250 families in this neighborhood. We have the Hispanic, the Latinos, the Black community. 𝗣𝐻𝗃 is all of it. 𝗣𝐻𝗃 represents about 100 different countries. We speak about 50 different languages, and you know this, Darrell, right? Captain Darrell. And so why aren't you using our resources? Why aren't you reaching out to the community? When you talk about ambassador programs and implicit bias training, we're right there. And I know policing of Culmore, I could, it's not, there's no equity in the way those black and brown boys are being pulled over and frisked for no reason in the Culmore area. So I would like to, to ask you, are you reaching out to us, the Black and brown community?
We are. And I say that in summary because my previous assignment, I was the assistant commander in the Personnel Resources Division. I directly had my recruiters go out into the mosques, go out into the communities of color. We had a campaign where we recruited Fairfax first. I believed, based on what they wanted me to do, in order to stem the tide of some of the bad contacts and the disproportionate contacts, we needed people to represent the community of Fairfax County. I would often tell my staff, I said, if you look left and look right, Fairfax County is brown. It is very diverse, a lot of different people. And why not recruit from that population? Because once you recruit from that population and begin to bring them into the culture of law enforcement, you have a different reaction when they have contact with the public. Because what I was saying earlier, when they get locked into that culture, sometimes color means criminal. And we're trying to reverse that by training them to say, no, color is not an automatic reason to stop them and to frisk them and that they're committed a crime.
Thanks, Darrell. I have a ton more questions for you, but I got to let the audience get some in. So waiting for those to be pulled up right now.
Can I say something while we wait?
Sure.
Sure. And you know, Darrell's right, and you know, I think the Fairfax County Police Department is trying to get more community input. I, as an activist, am always suspicious of it because I'm like, well, you're going to get our input, but where's it going to go, right? I want to see action, and sometimes things here tend to die by committee. But what I want to do for the audience, though, is make the clear delineation of the NAACP position and the FCPD position. I think FCPD and forgive me if I'm wrong, Darrell, you can always correct me, but I think the police in general believe that they can train their way out of this problem. I don't know if I believe that there's enough training to do that. Implicit bias is a very tricky thing because you have to get the person to even understand that they have a bias they may not be aware of. So when we talk about getting SROs out of schools, when we talk about legalizing cannabis, these are to reduce the interaction between the police and the community. Because if we can reduce the interactions, then we can make sure that people who are not, unless there's a call saying there's a crime happening, you don't have these interactions that lead to the criminalization unnecessarily. And with cannabis, it's not even so much people who use it that's of importance, because what happens is police can say, well, I thought I smelled something. And then that justifies any and every stop. Even in states where it's been decriminalized, where you can still get a ticket, the police justification of, oh, I thought I smelled something, gets them out at any and every time. So this is why these things which may not seem as obvious, it's important that we look into these issues, because it's going to reduce the interactions between the police and communities of color when it doesn't need to happen. The other thing I would say is that we always need to keep in mind, we are always teetering between the edge of a bad interaction with police that can blow up in our community. I said this when the George Floyd incident happened, and I was told, you know, things like this don't happen in Fairfax County. Not more than 3 or 4 days later, after I was told that, we saw Officer Timberlake brutalize a man with a stun gun, and he was eventually arrested by the chief of police and others. But the police reaction to that tells you a lot too, because the police turned on Chief Rossler because of that arrest. So there is something within the culture that we need to address. But I think while we are trying to address that, we need to focus on reducing the interactions that are unnecessary between communities of color and the police.
And just to give you,
I have to go to the questions, Darrell. I know that you want to say a lot, and we can continue this dialogue, but we have like close to 60 people on with us too. And I know you have a lot to say. I know Mike is sitting there ready, because I've listened to some of his webinars as well. And we have a lot to say on this issue, Darrell. And so if we could just take a couple of questions, and then we can continue the discussion. I'm willing to give up my closing remarks just to listen to you guys. That's how passionate I am about this. So let me just take a couple of questions. Okay, the disparities against Blacks have been there for many years, and they're well known. Why is it taking so long to address them? And that could go to Sean or any one of you. And then I'm just gonna go ahead and say the second one. Why do you think having SROs in the school brings more issues for Blacks, Latinos, handicapped, etc.? If a student is causing trouble, it shouldn't matter who they are. An SRO should be able to help intervene if necessary. I grew up in the Fairfax County school system in the 80s. I can't imagine going back to the day when we didn't have protection when necessary. So those are two questions. Do you want me to repeat them? Because I had Sean's name in the first one, but Darrell, you can go if you feel, but somebody suggested it should go to Sean. So
I'll answer in reverse order. So you grew up in the school system in the 80s when you didn't have cops, and you made it through, as did many others. So you know there is a world where that is possible. But to get to your question, what you're saying, sort of misses the entire point of kids cause trouble, right? Not all trouble that kids cause needs to be handled by a police officer. During your time growing up, if a kid was causing trouble, you had detention, you had counselors who intervened, you had any means and mechanism. Even now, there's all sorts of ways that you can discipline a child without arresting them. So this is what I'm saying when you say causing trouble. As I pointed out, the arrests and stuff we were seeing were not for kids carrying weapons or kids having gangs. And I'll point to the fact that what I told you, we saw this mass reduction, 60% reduction in arrests when we made the changes between the memorandum of understanding and how the police operated. We didn't see a rise in crime in schools because what was happening was that kids were being arrested for things that could have been handled through a disciplinary measure, whether that be detention or whatever else. So when you say kids causing trouble, you have to again look at, is this trouble that if it were a white kid would be handled a different way, which is what the examples Mike was trying to give you. So when you say you're assuming that the police officer is right in getting involved, and what we see time and time again is there are other means to do this. And what was the first question?
So the other question was the disparities against Blacks have been there for many, many years. Why is it taking so long to address them? And so that can come from either of the three of you at this point.
If someone else wants to answer, but I would say my 2 cents on that is I had the same question. There really wasn't that urgency when we saw this data year after year after year about use of force. I think that the political climate is such and the cultural climate is such that people are now getting involved. But again, Black people make up 9% of this county. We are a minority of this county. Until white individuals start to care about, hey, this isn't right, what's happening here, the politicians don't really feel, I think, the necessity to address those issues. And again, that's my opinion, but this is why I think with the Black Lives Matter movement and everything else that we've seen this urgency now that we didn't see before.
So I'm gonna go to Darrell and then Mike, but I do want to say the urgency has always been there because Martin Luther King had a sense of urgency and we're still waiting, for the dream to happen. But I think the visual of the murder send us into a new kind of urgency. But Darrell, can you please chime in here? And then Mike, please.
I'm going to try to get into like the mechanics of why I think it is happening within Fairfax County. I think Chief Rossler was already going in the direction of looking at the data because some argue that the community is being emotional about it. And how can you prove it? You have to prove it through data. I think as the way we work in terms of a culture, I've challenged some of my colleagues recently because I'm having these conversations about race and implicit bias. I think historically, we as a police department, we've done it in such a way where we've taken our most aggressive officers and put them in the most diverse neighborhoods, such as the Route 7 corridor, the Route 1 corridor, or the Springfield area of some parts of Reston. And because we have that connection, being brown and Black means criminal, we put our most aggressive officers in these neighborhoods. And what we've taught them within our agency is, if you make high numbers of arrests, if you make high drug arrests, your name is out there so that you can go to the specialized positions as a detective and to gain glory and prestige from your colleagues. I said, why not reverse that? Why not take our most aggressive officers and put them in some of our more affluent neighborhoods to give that community great service? And maybe the officers who don't show those signs in the academy of being most aggressive may have the empathy and the capacity to properly police the neighborhoods of color to begin reconciliation and begin that healing. So I'm trying to get them to look at it in a very reverse way, say, hey, we need to think about this because we keep putting these aggressive officers in these neighborhoods and they see it as a positive in terms of the number game.
Yeah, and those officers, especially in the 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐬, I go to 𝐏𝐿𝐴 because I read a lot about it and what's happening in the 𝐏𝐿𝐴 area right here in Fairfax. And it's just so normalized, like the Hispanic, the Latinos, the Black and brown boys, they just know they can get pulled over. People know they can walk into their house, and they get so friendly that it's become a normal thing that they're, the police is out there in unmarked cars. So, I mean, there's more about that I would like to talk, but I want to hear from Mike as well. Thank you, Darrell.
𝐼, I can address that. Or if you had another question you wanted to throw in, I could speak to as well.
So the other question I think Mike talked about, because he addressed, and let me see if there's another one. Is there another question? Okay, to the degree, to what degree do the expectations of teachers about the academic and general intellectual abilities of African American and Latino children have an impact?
That's part of the problem, but it doesn't necessarily drive it. I mean, Black and Latino kids are underrepresented for advanced academics based on their proportion in the student body, and white and Asian students are overrepresented. Vice versa when it comes to discipline. So there is a connection, but you know, it's not just what their abilities are. Because again, both my sons, advanced academic classes they've been in, they're still being treated a certain way. They're still being responded to. They're still triggering things in a mainly white teaching force that causes them to react and respond in ways that should not be done to children. You know, and only thing I will touch on the previous question about SROs is that because you have, and I want everyone to hear me clearly, because you have an institution that is racist as a school system, people are actors within that system and they are often perpetuating it. So you have administrators and teachers who are using that bad programming to activate SROs when they have no business being around. They're calling, because it's not clear when they even should be brought in, it's just their way of dealing with conflict. Like they've the same way that police have too much responsibility in terms of social work and family relations and all those other things they're not really trained for, SROs is somehow supposed to do the same thing that education professionals aren't willing to take on or ill-suited for themselves.
Okay.
No, that was brilliant. Thank you. And anybody else wanted to chime in on that? I do have another question. How likely is it that training will be sufficient to change culturally ingrained implicit bias? This is for you, Darrell. And what is the racial makeup of the Fairfax County Police? I think you already spoke about that, but yeah, when will the police force look like us? And
it's gonna take a while. We hope that we can move the needle when we do the implicit bias training. We're hoping that we move the needle. And the way we used to do our implicit bias training was through our e-learning with the online system, and officers would go in and click, 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 move on past into the next subject. The reason why we're doing it in person with an outside vendor, because they're not connected with the county, and they can now have these difficult conversations about implicit bias and to take the test right there within the training to try to move the needle some. This is not a fast turnaround. Sometimes I think many can think that, well, if you go through implicit bias training, then you've been blessed and you're going to go out and behave. But those implicit biases made us who we are today. They're not going anywhere. We're just trying to get our agency, our sworn and civilian and volunteer staff to recognize I have this bias. How do I go around it? Because what came up in that mindset is not going away, but how do I go around it to make sure I'm being fair in process? I'm being transparent. I'm giving that community member voice in my decision or in the engagement to be fair about what we do. This is not an easy task. It's going to take some time. And that's why I said we're looking at a 1 to 3 year window of training everybody over and over every year, 8 hours of implicit bias and procedural justice training, because it not only happens with our community members, but it happens inside the police department too.
So we are going to start moving the time-wise. There was a comment. There's a book called On the Come Up, which is a fictional story about a high school girl and deals with SROs. So that's just for a comment made by someone who wanted to do more research on that. And I think we have all addressed a lot of the questions already. So we'll move to the next section unless you guys have a burning statement. The next portion is a video and then a Q&A.
The only thing I can say, you said, how does that work? Right now, we've worked with community, the police department, and that human relations policy we're working on, we're going to try to roll out this January. We've worked with co-production teams, the academic background, the interfaith background, where I met some of the persons in the group here, and to help us with our policies, because sometimes we can have many blind spots, but when we work with the co-production teams of the community, they give us a viewpoint that we may not think about. And in that policy, we're directly introducing implicit bias, procedural justice, de-escalation internally and externally, and trust building. So we're working on it. We're making it policy to try to change the behavior and culture.
So during COVID, 𝗣𝐻𝗲𝗃 has been, and other communities as well, but 𝗣𝐻𝗃 in particular, our social services department has been reaching out. Like we've had, food banking, and it's increased over COVID. And a lot of it is from our Hispanic community. But whenever we ask them to fill out forms, they're so shy. So the mistrust is so like ingrained, that people are so scared. And then, maybe later on in this webinar, we could talk about the relationship between police and ICE and how we police 𝐏𝐫𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐧𝐭𝐞𝐝 But now I think, Judith, are we moving to a video at this point? I didn't look at raise hands in this portion, but we will go to raise hands in the second Q&A. So please forgive me for those of you that were doing raise hands in this portion, we didn't get to you. We will get to you in the next section. Judith, I'm ready. And if everybody's ready, we're ready to look at the video.
What would you do if your child was placed in handcuffs for crying at school? Well, this was a reality for a 7-year-old black boy in Missouri, and it isn't rare for black and brown kids across the country. Whether it's getting arrested for talking back or doodling on a desk, in-school policing is harming students by taking them out of school and helping funnel them into prisons. It's called the school to prison pipeline. We're talking about a structure of codes and punishments that criminalizes kids as early as preschool and increases their chances of ending up in the criminal justice system. 99% of New York City school children who were handcuffed in 2016 were Black or Latinx. This happens when school resource officers are called into classrooms to discipline students, sometimes for something as small as violating a dress code or grabbing candy from a teacher's desk. If the offense doesn't lead to an arrest, Black and brown students are still subject to harsher punishments than white students. Black students are 4 times more likely to be suspended than their white peers. Sometimes students are kicked out of school for basically just being Black. Like in cases across the country where Black girls were suspended for rocking braids or an afro. So, where do students go after they've been kicked out of school? Research shows they're 3 times more likely to end up in the juvenile justice system within a year. This is all part of an endless cycle. Once kids touch the juvenile justice system, they're 67% more likely to end up in jail again before they're 25. So, what lessons are schools and police really teaching our kids here? How can kids excel in school if they're always being kicked out of them?
Okay, so I think we touched on some of this before, and I'll see if we have any direct questions. But in the meantime, I wanted you to know that that particular video resonates with me because a lot of my work is with mentoring kids, not just in the in the Como area in Fairfax, but I also mentor kids in the DC Youth Detention Center. And that revolving door is very evident with that, that video that we just saw. And the questions that are coming in today, they're good. I'm glad people are brave enough to ask these questions, and you guys are brave enough to be here to answer them. And I think people want to know, where do we go from here? But I just want to say that I can give you 1,000 stories, and I know we all have stories. I work with the boys and the girls. There's a minority of girls locked up in the youth detention center, not just here in Fairfax, but more if we look at our neighbor in Washington, DC and Maryland. I would go in there before COVID, and 99% of the kids are Black. And if you see a brown or barely beige kid in the juvie system, they are probably of Hispanic descent. And so I'm wondering what happened in that courtroom? Because as a lawyer who did juvie law myself, I'm like, I've seen it play out, but I've seen it play out in Indiana, and those are white courtrooms, and all the Black boys were going down and the white boys were going home. So we could sit here and talk about it all day long, but I want to hear some more stories from the people that are on here. And I know that Eleanor has a story to share with us today. And Eleanor, why don't you go ahead really quickly and give us that nutshell, because her story is like amazing, but I know you made it into a nutshell for us today, right? Can't hear you, Eleanor.
But there I go.
There you are.
Are you referring to the story that I mentioned the other night about the Obama election?
Did it relate to what we just saw?
Okay, you need to tell me which story I'm supposed to.
Okay, I don't know. Judith and I talked about this, that you wanted to share a story. So you could just share one of your stories. You have a minute or two.
Okay.
What do you think is relevant?
This actually does not relate to the school to prison pipeline, but what I wanted to say is,
why don't you introduce yourself a little bit?
Okay, my name is Eleanor Saswaw. I am a lifelong educator. I worked as a teacher, a counselor, a director of student services. I then went to the State Board of Education and served 8 years there and 2 years as president, making policy. So some of the policy issues you raised tonight, I personally saw in dealing with the public that came to the board, and it actually did change policies. I'm now on the State Community College Board, and was chair for a year and was reappointed in that. I'm now a member. So I'm also working with a group of students in all 23 colleges that many come from the school to prison pipeline, come out to try to be successful citizens in society, do not have a method by which they can support a family. So consequently, we are concentrating on what we call workforce development, short training to give people a trade and to be able to get stackable credentials. And these were the people who often were unsuccessful in the public school system to be able to make their way through and secure a positive position in society. So as a counselor, I saw many instances of what we were talking about today, and often had to represent a student so that their situation was completely exposed, that it wasn't related to just one incident that would determine their future. But one thing that doesn't relate to the school to prison pipeline that I mentioned the other day in planning is that all of us, regardless of our background, are stereotyped. And the stereotype that I'm going to tell you about doesn't seem like much, but it really struck me that during Obama's first run as president, My husband and I were traveling. We made friends with a couple at the dinner table in a restaurant, started talking about the election. And because we were white and middle-aged or older, I won't say how old, it was automatically assumed that we were not going to support Obama. So there are such implicit assumptions as well as biases that we all come into contact with either culturally, religiously, racially, ethnically, or any other way as we go through life. And that's my point in terms of working with children to help them realize their very best potential, to really see them as individual and incidents in terms of the whole child. That's all I've got to say.
Thank you for sharing that from the other side and the example you gave of, you know, what you just gave about you and your husband. That was good because it's looking at the lens from the other side. But I do have some questions coming up on my right hand here. I don't see any hands raised, but there's a question for Darrell. It says, tell us more about trust building. Is it more than personal relationships or positive community programs?
Yes, trust building starts when we know through data where we've not had such good relationships with communities of color in particular. What we're trying to do with trust building, we're trying to go and meet the community representatives and then sit down and have that police officer, community member conversation about what has happened in their neighborhoods. And just to get the police to hear it in a different light about what that community member is going through and talk about it from a historical perspective. And then to try to bridge that gap between the police officer and that community member to work in partnerships on preventing crimes and to work on reconciliation and to continue to bring in more people in to have these difficult discussions, sitting down at the table, one-on-one, where we mix the crowds at the table, meaning police and community members, and have these difficult conversations to start building that trust again. And within our own agency, the same thing. Begin to start having these conversations about race, about gender and gender differences and everything, and to talk about those triggers and say, hey, look, it's okay to have that as well as the community, and let's talk about it and let's build on it and let's build that trust.
Sorry, Darrell, I was just looking at a hand up, but no, thank you for sharing that. And I'm looking forward to hearing from you because I want to help you in this process. That's why we have an outreach department at 𝗣𝗲𝗀𝗃 and even ICD. We're all here to help you to get this done. This is like, we're ready to roll our sleeves up. I've been ready, you know that. So we do have a hand up. Where is it? Where'd it go? Can you help me? Do you see it? I think, according to my notes, Manny Salone has a hand up, and I just don't know. Manny, can you just go ahead, unmic yourself, and ask your question?
Well, I've been a long time participant in the ICD. Marie Munson will know who I am and some of the other people. I love everybody. It's a great presentation, but I'm by nature a contrarian. And I'll say how old I am. I'm going to be 86, and I've been involved in these issues for a long time. And I've had hope for a lot of different things. And many of the steps that have been taken are very, very necessary. So I applaud all that. The point is, with most minds of people, they think if they pass enough regulation, they can do good. Unfortunately, I've also had experience on the Fairfax County School Board. I've been on the Human Rights Commission, and there are certain things you can write all the rules you want, unless you really change the hearts and minds. This, to me, is the religious problem, the religious issue, because just when they first passed affirmative action, yay, I got addressed by a speaker there, and I said to him, some people may take this as quotas. He said, no, if you do that, it's racist. So what happened? How many ads have there been? Famously, I think it was in South Carolina or North Carolina. The very conservative senator wrote there, had this ad about a guy wringing his hands. I could have gotten that job. So for every time a black gets a job, there are 100 white people believe they could have gotten that job. They ignore all the other people where they get discriminatory things. So you have to really bend over backwards. And I seen, being on the human relations, the Fairfax County Human Relations Commission, we have laws. Some of our staff mean well. You have to cross every I and dot every T. It defeats justice. You have to have equity and you have to have justice, and you can't write that down because somebody will get around the regs. I've also been an ombudsman in nursing homes. It's the most regulated industry in the United States. The management gets around it. So and my last question, I posted this, my last comment would be, I saw there with aides, there were some aides, they all were trained, but some had a natural empathy. I used to say, find the people with the natural empathy who want to do the job and care for it, where it's not just a job. Train them, because you can't train sympathy, empathy, caring for people. So with any kind of job, I know it's hard. They got to recruit teachers that way. They got to recruit policemen that way. And if I could devise a test to do it, I would do it. But it may not be so there is no definite answer. We have to work towards it and pray God that we'll get there. Thank you. Sorry for the preaching.
Manny, thank you so much for your comments. And I would like to hear a response. I'm going to start with Mike. Okay,
Sure, thanks.
with Mike, and then I'm just going to give an order here. Mike, Darrell, if you want to say something, Sean, if you want to say something about what Manny said, and then Pammy. So we'll go in that order. Go ahead.
I think that it's important to know that hearts and minds, I understand, and I've heard that argument, and at times I've been successful in that through personal relationship with somebody. But the problem is that it presumes that everybody's acting on hate, like they're acting with malicious intent. And the most widespread effects of racism are not because people have hate in their hearts. It's because policies are created that will punish others, let others off the hook, will not exact accountability for people.
I may not have been clear, I'm sorry. I'm not against the policy. It's who's interpreting them and how they interpret them. Where you have a no tolerance policy, you get a girl dismissed because she gave her girlfriend a Tylenol, I think, when the other girl was having her menstrual cycle. That's ridiculous. But they do. You have to have some judgment, and you have to make sure that people aren't misusing the judgment. Most people want to do CYA. I can't get in trouble in medicine or many other fields if I covered whatever the procedure was. You can't write procedures or laws to cover every that's what I mean by having good. You can't cover every exigency. And they say bad cases make bad law, because they try and legislate extreme cases out of there. And I could go on for hours. I don't know what the answer is.
There's a second.
I'm going to let Mike finish his thought, and then we'll go to Darrell and Sean.
I think there's a point to be made about bad policy, and that's the problem. Some policies are so problematic that enforcement of them hurts people. One of the students I'd referenced before, when the child was in second grade, suspended 12 times. There is no love for a child if they're suspended 12 times in 1 year. That's a fundamental year also for strengthening, developing literacy skills. Should it be a surprise that in middle school, this child has some coding, certain technical reading challenges because during their second grade year, they spent so much time away from the school? So if it was just about love, that never would have gotten to that point. 12 times in 1 year for a 7-year-old.
I think to try to answer that question about the hearts and minds, we already know through the training with One Fairfax that when we talk about these issues, we know a third of the department in the civilian professional staff, I'm sorry, get it. They get it right away. But we know there's a huge middle that's very silent right now. And so we're going to focus our attention on that middle group, and in the long term, continue to work on that other group that says, no, I just don't care. We're looking at all of our policies through One Fairfax to look at and go through our policies to make sure that good intentions sometimes have adverse, I guess, what's the word I'm looking for? Adverse, I'm drawing a blank on the word. You guys know what I mean. But so we're trying to look at all of our policies to make sure that we're not, our policies don't have bad intentions by reworking our policies with our co-production teams to say, hey, look, this is our policy on, say, sexual harassment. We're following the procedural memorandum, but what are we doing inside to make sure that our leaders who will enforce the policy understand it and they don't let the culture take over that policy? That's what we're trying to do by having these difficult conversations.
Thank you, Sean. Do you want to respond?
No, not really a response, but I just wanted to touch on some of the things we've talked about in the video and everything and try to bring it together. Has this group at all been familiar with 𝐏𝐫𝐶𝐬𝐞𝐬𝐞𝐬? He wrote the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and stand
I
from the
think some
beginning.
of us.
Some of you may be familiar with it. His whole thing is to get away from whether you're a racist or not racist, right? Because then that implies some sort of intention. Like I'm not a racist. I don't have a racist bone in my body. That's what people always say. So he gets more into you're either a racist or an anti-racist. And one of the distinctions he makes is when we see these sort of disparities, we say, well, what we try to get to, the question we start to ask is, what is going on there that we're seeing these racial disparities? What is causing that? What racist policy is causing that? So we've seen this already on the line when we talked about the arrested schools. Someone said, well, if those kids are causing trouble, then they should be arrested. And it goes back to when someone said, well, why hasn't this been addressed sooner? It's because people assume that what's happening is fair. And we talked about the stereotypes. If you have a stereotype that Black and Latinx kids probably cause trouble, then there's nothing to address, right? You just think that that's what's happening. But it's when we have this anti-racist mentality that we say, well, what's going on, that we dig a little bit deeper and to get into the things. And everyone has stereotypes. When you meet someone right away, if they're tall or short or whatever, you automatically have some assumption about them. But some of the stereotypes that it relates to Black individuals is dangerous, especially when teachers think it. When they see a student and they may say, there's no point in me trying to get through to the student, I won't be able to. So these are the dangerous stereotypes that we see. And I'll give the example of Thomas Jefferson High School. When I talked about the issues in Thomas Jefferson, someone said to me, well, if Black kids can't get into it, they're just not working hard enough. But see, if they had started with the dynamic that Dr. Kendi had came up with, they would have said, well, what's going on here? And what we find is Black kids do get into TJ and they choose not to go. We had 6 that got in and chose not to go. Then when we dug even deeper, Black kids were passing the objective test to get into TJ, and then there was a subjective criteria that they were failing. So what is the subjective criteria, right? Then we can have a discussion about that. So I say all of this because I think when we talked about that video and people having braids and they were getting arrested for that, when we look at these issues and we talk about hearts and minds, us having this conversation is the conversation we are having to change hearts and minds. Because I'm not just talking to you, I'm trying to go throughout the community and have these conversations of getting people to rethink their framework and say, what is going on in my community that we're seeing these disparities? That's how we address hearts and minds. We have to address the symbolic and the hearts and minds. I agree with Manny who said that. But then we also have to have the policy discussion too, and they go hand in hand. So Manny, you're right. We have to talk about hearts and minds, and that's what we're doing when on a Sunday afternoon. We talk for 2 hours about racism, but then we also have to address the policy and say, how do we wed these two ideas to make our community better? So that's what I would say in response to Manny and those folks. And it's why, honestly, when we take on some of the symbolic battles, you know, the NAACP was really involved in changing the name of Robert E. Lee High School to John Lewis. And some people say, well, you know, there's so many problems. Why would you address something like that? Because if you can't even acknowledge that it's wrong to send Black kids to a school named after someone who fought in a war to keep them enslaved, then how can you acknowledge the more complex of, you know, you're sending kids to prison because you have implicit bias? Because all of that is building on that implicit bias, that you don't understand that that's wrong, that you shouldn't do that. So these are some of the difficult conversations when we talk about the symbolic changes that we're having in the hearts and mind conversation. It's these sort of dialogues that I think we address that in.
Well, I feel like we're doing some church today, but hearts and minds. And thank you for taking that aspect of hearts and minds. Pammy, I think you had a question or your hands up. Would you like to join us in this discussion?
Yes. Thank you, Fazia. I just want to take the conversation into a slightly different direction, if I may. I'm recognizing that there is diversity within the white community, and there's a whole range of policies as well, which have been tried in the past. So the question for the three panelists, and maybe for other speakers or other participants as well, would be, are there any stories of success where white people have helped to reduce racism in Fairfax County or the country, and which policies also have helped to reduce? So we can see it's not just a completely, glass is completely empty. There's been progress. So I'd like to focus also slightly on what has worked, and we can learn from those experiences also. So could you address that aspect?
Sure. Within Fairfax County, within the police department, what we did, we worked with DOJ, we worked with the county attorney in terms of our questions that we ask our applicants who apply for the police department. We went in and we tried to take out the bias out of our questions. I think in the beginning, many years ago, some of the persons who put those questionnaires together to bring in that diversity had great intentions, but they had adverse outcomes. So we had to go in and look at those questions, just like the Black Lives Matter movement. When I went to the Personnel Resources Division, I had to explain to my staff that we got to take the question out about, have you ever participated in a protest? I said, because think about it. I said, if a kid, when they go to college, they learn that foundation for their social consciousness. If they participate in the Black Lives Matter movement or rally, then we can't have that question in our questionnaire, because that's bias, because they're now thinking, is that bad? And say if we had an examiner who's doing a polygraph examination, they're examining them saying, hey, this kid said they participated in this movement, there must be something wrong. Now, in terms of success stories, we did move the needle in Personnel Resources Division by bringing in more women recently, more applicants from all Asian backgrounds, and we increased the number of African Americans, because at one point we were losing them at 94% across the board at all levels of our hiring processes. So we've addressed that to say, hey, these are the questions. We have to train our staff to understand that their socioeconomic conditions may not be that of criminal. It may just, they may have come from that, but if it meets this criteria based on the Code of Virginia, then we hire that person and move forward.
Anybody else would like to respond to Pammy's question?
Yeah, I'll say specific to schools. I know that, Sean already alluded to some changes to the MOU between police department and the schools regarding SROs, but also there have been some changes to the disciplinary policy. I think the issue is white people are not likely to make a policy change on their own initiative, because really understanding and studying, appreciating how racism functions, it's much longer than a 2-hour talk that we're having. It has to be building up a competency, a capacity to analyze everything that you look at in a different way. And often, because how this country is structured, these problems aren't affecting them personally. So it's usually not our nature to push for something that is not affecting us directly, and we're not as well versed on it. So it's not that they don't advocate for a change, but often it has to be brought from outside. And I think that's where the greatest impact can be made. It's in white people building up their awareness and understanding of the racial dynamic, the racist structures and institutions, so that, yeah, you definitely want to be informed by those who are subjected to it, but you don't have to wait for them to look at plenty of data, come to a conclusion, and then start asking questions, because that's the pressure. I mean, again, to point to TJ, people who were outraged that equity was about to be levied out in a more humane fashion than it has been. This same group had nothing to say year after year after year after year when kids were being disproportionately disciplined or cut off from access to advanced learning.
Okay, so I'm looking at the time right now. Pammy, are you satisfied with that answer? Do you want to hear from anybody else?
I think Marie and Kay have raised their hands. So let's just hear
Okay.
them.
All right, we have 20 minutes and we have a poll to do. So, Marie?
Yeah, just a quick comment. I agree with Mike that white people have to do the work. And my feeling is, and I'm 81 now, I was raised in New York. I have Black friends. What really made a substantive difference in my life was not statistics. It was when I read *Beloved* and then read some James Baldwin. That was when, at a gut level, I understood what racism as a system, I think, does to all of us, and that is there, that shapes how we look at things. And I think before we can change the majority of people and having people of color pushing that rock up the hill, we have to do work with white people. And I have found reading books like *Beloved*, where you really get inside how a person is thinking, or *The Bluest Eye*, even better. That and role playing, which is something the Baha'i have been doing when they've had racism discussions. And when you have to play the part of a different person, that's another way to break into you internally, and affect not just your mind, but your gut.
Thank you, Marie. I think Kate had her hands up. Did somebody want to make a comment on that? Because we're like really short on time right now.
I wanted to, but I'll wait.
Thank you, Sean. Because I would also, I don't know what you wanted to talk about, but I would like to hear about something you said on another webinar. You gave an example about the death sentence. And to me, that was a clear vision. Like, I was like, wow, there it was. And so if you could say something about that in the end. I'm going to go to Kay, who has her hand up.
I can be quick. I think just in responding to Pammy, as a white privileged woman, older too, Marie, I crave my Black friends, and you three great models that have spoken, to tell me, do this, this, and this. And I guess reading Kendi's book and our church, A Success Story, our church did a goodly number of us read the book. We also have studied United Church of Christ materials. We're Baptists, but we studied the materials that are on white privilege. They're excellent if any of you are interested. And it really has been pretty transforming and understanding the systemic problems that we've been laissez-faire about, I will say it that way, speaking for myself through many years. I think a lot of us are really ready to work, and we're committed to it, Pammy, but it is work, and it's a heavy duty commitment. And we want you to know we understand as much as we can, and we are trying. So I think that's a success story.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. I think Stephen, you had your hand up, and then I don't know if Marty Swain can hear us. She is a phenomenal person. She's on here. If she wants to make a comment, I would love to hear from her. She's going to be on our fourth webinar. But Marty, if you had a comment, but before that, we can hear what Stephen's question is.
Okay, it's not so much a question, but it is a comment. When the Black Lives Matter and the whole issue of racial reckoning started last summer after the murder of George Floyd, one of the local talk show hosts, I will not name him, basically said that part of the real 36,000-foot problem was that Black Lives Matter was trying to make collectively white people feel guilty. I don't believe that, because white people have been in denial about a lot of the problems that we have been discussing today, and also about a lot of the the overall view of how America sees itself throughout its history, through its culture, et cetera, et cetera. I think that Muhammad Ali video put it quite succinctly, and he had and that is the real challenge that we all of us have to face. What is it about whiteness that makes us entitled to feel dominant over everybody else? I know that may be a little
That's a heavy question.
intense, but that's my feeling, and I'm looking forward to the next time when we discuss housing, because that affected my professional career when I was working.
So I do have two more people. Thank you for that, Stephen. Thank you so much. Manjeet, and then Melinda, and then if we have time, I'll see if I can elicit a comment from Marty Swain. Go ahead.
Is it for me?
Yes.
Okay. Well, the comment I wanted to make actually has been made. I want all the participants to know you can see I wear a turban. I have been here for 48 years now. I've been teaching for 45 years. I have all kinds of friends, and I want to be accepted by everybody also. But I very strongly feel that none of us should make a comment that white people are wrong or this or that. We have to figure out a way, because people inherit certain things. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yes,
okay,
go ahead.
So we have to figure out a way, because most people love each other. Yes, there are certain, and so we have to make a strategy where we show respect and join hands with those who understand our cause and make them part of us. We become part of them. So our diversity can bring a lot more strength, and on basis of that diversity, we move forward. Like, for example, Black Matter Lives, you all saw all kinds of people were attending those, meetings, if you want to use the word. So I become a little bit disturbed in my mind when I say that I use the word white people, because I don't want to use the word white people or brown people or black people. We are all people. Yes, we have suffered and we have to figure out a solution. So somehow, when we start talking about we are separating ourselves from others, we have to figure out to become one first, Thank you.
Thank you, Manjeet. Melinda, do you have a quick question?
Well, no, I just, I don't want to lose the time to be able to say, one of the things that we're all doing here is finding out what kind of support from the community we can give these three men who are devoting their careers to helping this situation get better. But we're all here, and while reading a book and discussing it and opening our eyes and being aware and saying something if we see something, what else can we do as community members individually, but also as a group, not white, black, not separated by either religion or race, but together.
And I think we're going to hear from the panelists in the concluding remarks about what we're going to ask them, what actions are necessary and how we can help them. So that was a brilliant. Thank you, Melinda, for bringing that up. And I do want to reach out to Marty Swain if she's available. Is she still there, Marty? Marty? Okay. How about Fahim? I think he had his hand raised for a little bit, and then we're going to go to the poll.
Yeah, hi. It's a big topic for me. I don't think I would be able to speak thoroughly about it. I just wanted to share my experience. I am an Uber driver.
Okay.
I am an Uber driver, and the kind of racist comments that I hear when I drive for Uber, and the kind of things when people actually read my name actually starts with Abdul. When they sit in my car and they tell me things about Islam, and they ask me about where I come from. I come from Afghanistan, and it's just unbelievable. I had a dream. I thought America would be so different, so unique, but I've been to Walmart, to the Giant store trying to find a job. And I haven't been able to find a job. It's very difficult. And when they read my name, when they look at my name, it's just, and they look at me, I just can't explain why they wouldn't hire me. It's been so difficult living in America.
For him, that's a really, thank you for sharing that personal matter. Like, it happened to me as well. I worked in the court system. I interned in a courthouse in Fort Wayne, Indiana for 4 years. I interned throughout law school, and you should just slide right into a job. Nobody had a job for me. I had to open a solo practice. So I'm really sorry this is happening to you, but stand firm and stay strong. And you have good people here today listening to us, and we're listening to them, and we're going to work together, and we're going to fix this. I believe we can do this. At this time, I think, can you hear me? We're going to do a poll, and then we're going to do some concluding remarks where our panelists will have a chance to all that stuff they're like edging to tell us before we leave today. So you guys are going to have a chance to say what's on your mind and tell us some actions that we can help you with. But before that, we have a quick poll.
At this point, our discussion was paused to allow us to conduct an anonymous poll of participants. The intent was to stimulate thought about the ways in which one may have personally experienced privilege and/or bias. Unfortunately, time constraints prevented utilization of the poll responses. We continue with the final segment of the program.
So concluding remarks from the panelists now, please. And Mike, you can go first, Darrell, and then Sean.
Thank you. I wanted to address Melinda's comment because it's nice having a discussion. I think we can learn some things, but you do need to be able to go forward and take action. And I think what has to be in folks' minds is that a lot of spaces you're in may be white dominated, white only spaces. Those are areas that you can work within right now because there are conversations, there's ideas, there are processes, policies in place that if you start to interrogate, poke a little, ask how they got constructed, you'd be surprised at the conversation at what would come from that. So there's a lot you can do within your own space. It doesn't always have to be a space where people of color are there. How the society was set up creates actually more white only spaces. And that's something you can start to question within your circles, within your various networks. So I think that would be the way in which you can make most immediate change. I think it's just so often looking at racism too often spends time looking at who it oppresses rather than who it benefits. And I think if you do more analysis of whiteness itself, and whiteness is a relationship to power. It's not your culture. It's strictly a relationship to power. And if you look at all the ways that it's woven in to your daily interactions, your lives, I think you'll find a lot that you can do. I did want to plug, and I think Fazia or somebody else can send this out. As I am chair of the Nova District PTA, having an anti-racism seminar this Saturday. It's virtual. It's from 1 to 5:30. Some of you, whether you have kids in school or grandchildren or just are connected to them, PTA is another large organization that has greater influence than it's currently using. And so I think you'll get a lot out of that and be able to bring some of that to any schools that you have any type of adjacency or relationship to. I appreciate the time tonight, and everyone have a good evening.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate you, Sean. Darrell?
Yes. I want to say thank you to everyone for spending your precious time this evening to begin these conversations. Anytime you're talking about racism and institutional racism, it's very difficult. In the meantime, if you could reach out to Supervisor Rodney Lusks, he's the chair of the Public Safety Committee, and you can help out with his tasks that he's trying to do right now. And also, we have a use of force committee. We're going to be looking at our use of force policy. We've convened some members from this group, particularly the interfaith community and the academic community, to help us look at our use of force and work on those very tough things that we're talking about right now in terms of looking at our policy. And there is some bias in the way our policy is written in terms of use of force, that we can then change the language to train the officers to have a better response when they deal with the public. I thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Darrell. Sean?
Thanks. And you wanted me to mention something about the death penalty, right?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, sure. So first, thank you for having me. I really appreciate being here. I know Melinda brought up what you can do, and she mentioned our careers. My career, I'm a lawyer by trade. I do this as part of my volunteer work. The NAACP is a completely volunteer organization. I bring that up to say that all of you can also do this. I found my voice in the NAACP. I encourage you to join your local chapter. We take all sorts and types of people. Join the Fairfax NAACP is a great way to engage with the community. And some of the things we do is, everything from sitting on different committees throughout the county and everything else. So that's one way you can get involved. But I want to bring it back to, I think it was Marie who mentioned reading books and how that impacted her. And that's so, so true. What we need, we're dealing with curriculum changes, right? Because we want to make sure that young people are reading these type of books and seeing this history and learning this thing, because so many people who grew up in Virginia learn really a biased and incorrect history, or they do not have exposure to literature from Black artists and work. So we need to make sure that we can push for that. And that's something that's easy to do here for everyone here. Write your local supervisor and say, write your local library, your board of trustees for the libraries and say, are you putting these books in the library? Are you putting these in front of students? Because we do want to reach those hearts and minds. So those are ways to do that. So those are just some of the ways that you can get involved. We need white people involved. And I want to say one thing, there was a gentleman who mentioned, talking about race. It's so critical to understand when we talk about race, we have to talk about whiteness. We cannot have a race blind discussion about this because, and I know we have Jewish people on this Zoom, you were not white before, you became white because it's a construct. It is not a biological thing. So when I talk about whiteness, I'm not talking about your skin, I'm not talking about the color of your eyes, I'm talking about the way our society treats different groups of people. And the only way we can have those conversations is by calling it out that white people are treated differently. Now, who is classified as white has changed over the course of history. So we have to have those discussions. And then finally, I would say, the most difficult part about these discussions for Black people and for myself is getting white people to understand that there is a problem, getting people to understand, to believe us, right? We're not the problem. There's something happening here and we need you to believe us. And that's why we talk about the data and the importance of that and the importance of telling stories. And then that will get me into my death penalty thing that I think 𝐏𝐲𝐶𝐶 is asking me to speak about. I was really struck with something that Brian Stevenson, who runs the Equal Justice Initiative, said. He was saying in Germany, they obviously have the history of the Holocaust. And if today in modern day Germany, they were giving, instituting the death penalty for Jewish people at enormous rates, we'd all be like, what is going on there? Is this a continuation of that? We'd obviously have skepticism about what was happening in modern day Germany if that was going on. Here in the United States, the death penalty is mostly given to Black people. And it's for the same, often the crimes are the same as the white counterparts, but they're the ones getting the death penalty. And we see that throughout our criminal justice system, that Black people are disproportionately punished more harshly, they're killed. And we know the history of lynchings here in this country. We know the histories of Jim Crow here, but we often are still second guessing, well, is there something really unfair happening in our criminal justice system? So I thought that was such a great connection to make, that if we looked at another country, we'd very clearly be able to see something is awry here. But often when we're at home, we can't see that same bias and unfairness. We can't see that historical significance of this group of people is still being disproportionately and unfairly treated here in our country. So I'll leave it with that, but I do think there's a lot we can do in our local communities. And I hope you all will stay involved. I hope you all will engage. And I'm just glad that I was able to speak with you all tonight. Thank you so much for having me.
And we're so indebted to you for coming out on a Sunday evening. Thank you for giving us your time. I know this conversation is opened up a lot. I feel like amazed right now, so much information. When I heard you speak about the death penalty in another webinar, it just struck me as there it is. If you don't understand it, then there's a clear big example that we can all relate to, comparing Germany to what we're missing here in this country, and it's right in our face. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you for being here, and thank you for taking the time to answer some tough questions, Darrell, Mike, and Sean. Everybody, thank you so much. At this time, Judith will now come on and give us a brief explanation of what's going to happen next in the next two seminars. Judith.
In 2 seconds, just to let you know that that we are planning to send out a brief survey, and would really, really be grateful if you would respond to that survey. We also will share some additional resources that you may be interested in. Some things got mentioned tonight, and I do want to say that I want to thank the panelists as well. And it's a shame that we ran out of time. These last couple of minutes were extremely valuable, some of the suggestions that were made, and they generated some additional questions about being able to follow up. So we will do our best to circle back to our panelists to get a little bit more information about some other things that are going on and where you can access some more information and share those as well. Thank you again. And this was a wonderful seminar. I hope that you will join us on January 31st when we do our next workshop focusing on health and housing.
And also Pammy's gonna say goodnight, but I just saw, Darrell, you said that the committee for Supervisor Lust is called Distribute to Ventures and Community. Supervisor Lusk is not Lusk, my apology, Lust. Okay, sorry, I just saw that note. But Pammy, you're up.
I want to add my thanks to what Fazia, you and Judith said. We really are very fortunate that Sean and Darrell and Mike were here with us. When the experience that you bring, the personal perspectives that you bring, we could not have got from anybody else. So we really are very fortunate to have had you. We've just scratched the surface. We'll need to do much more intensive self-reflection in our own communities, and we hope to stay engaged with you. Please join us in our subsequent workshops. Keep contributing to us as well. I would like to thank our planning committee as well, which has done a lot of work to bring this workshop to us. That includes Fazia, Judith, Eleanor Saslow, Manjeet Taneja, Melinda Roth, Fatima Popal, Asumini Kasuli, and Miriam Chatlib. This is the small working group that we have within ICD Steering Committee, and they're working on all these 4 workshops. So I'd like to express my thanks to that group as well. And of course, Judith, as you know, is behind the scenes, but one of our most active and valuable members on the steering committee. So special thanks to you, Judith. So with that, I'd like to end this workshop, and we hope to continue this conversation in our next one in January.
This has been a workshop on systemic racism in the education, police, and judicial systems. It was the second in a 4-part series presented by the Interfaith Communities for Dialogue. Session 3 on January 31st, 2021 will address systemic racism in health and housing. To view other workshop videos in this series, click on the playlist button below. To subscribe to our channel and receive notifications of new videos, click on the subscribe button below.